On the morning of July 26th, 1184, the bustling town of Erfurt in central Germany hosted a gathering of high nobles that would soon go horribly and disgustingly wrong. No one could have predicted that this day would end with roughly 60 nobles being drowned in a slurry of noxious human waste. Whether this event was truly an accident, or whether this was the equivalent of a real-life red wedding with a thick coat of brown paint, remains up for debate. The Holy Roman Empire of the 12th century was rife with local feuds that threatened the realm's stability. One such conflict pitted Ludwig III, the Landgrave of Thuringia, against Conrad, the Archbishop of Mainz, in a bitter struggle over lands and authority. Erfurt itself was under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Mainz, and Ludwig aimed to challenge that control for his own gain. Their rivalry grew so heated that the young King Henry VI, at that time ruling Germany under his father Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, decided imperial intervention was necessary. Henry, eager to be seen as a strong and capable monarch, took on the mediator's role with zeal, keen to secure peace and uphold royal authority in his domains. Henry VI accordingly convened an informal royal assembly in Erfurt to bring the feuding parties together and resolve their differences. He summoned dozens of nobles, bishops, and high-ranking officials from across the empire to attend a council in late July 1184. The gathering was held in a hall within Erfurt's cathedral, and by the morning of July 26th, this hall's upper floor was packed shoulder to shoulder with important people. Most important amongst the guests included King Henry himself, Archbishop Conrad, Landgrave Ludwig, as well as numerous lesser lords and advisors. As discussions got underway that morning, the crowded assembly of nobles strained the aging upper chamber. The sheer weight of so many men put tremendous stress on the timber floor supports. According to contemporary chroniclers, without warning, those wooden beams, long weakened by years of use and neglect, suddenly gave way with a deafening crack. The upper floor collapsed and crashed down onto the level below, which in turn also failed under the impact. In an instant, the entire meeting, people, furniture, and flooring, plunged through the structure and into an enormous cesspit beneath the hall. Knights in armor, wooden tables and benches, and splintered beams all hurtled into the vile pit as the building disintegrated around them. In the chaotic moments that followed, those who fell met an appalling fate. They found themselves floundering in years of accumulated foul waste, a mix of excrement and groundwater, which had a thick, quicksand-like consistency that made escape nearly impossible. Luckier victims were crushed by falling timbers and furnishings. Those who weren't as fortunate drowned in the muck or succumbed to the poisonous miasma of the noxious fumes. The cesspit's contents were also rife with disease and parasites, adding another lethal element to the disaster. Contemporary reports indicate that roughly 60 men died then and there, and some accounts suggest the death toll may have reached closer to 100 in total. Among the dead were a number of prominent nobles. However, miraculously, or perhaps suspiciously, all the key members in attendance escaped with their lives. Interestingly, two of the most prominent individuals were completely unharmed. King Henry VI himself escaped the plunge entirely. He and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz had been sitting on a stone-reinforced window alcove when the floor fell, and they managed to cling to it as the chamber collapsed around them. Rescuers with ladders eventually pulled the king and the archbishop to safety, and while they were both shaken, and perhaps stirred, they were essentially unharmed. Landgrave Ludwig III, who had tumbled down with the rest of the crowd, also survived and was hauled out of the cesspit alive. For King Henry, there was little time to dwell on the horrific accident. Chronicles report that he departed Erfurt almost immediately afterward and resumed a military campaign he had been on, effectively abandoning the unresolved dispute between the lords. In essence, the mediation abruptly ended, and the long-standing conflict between the Landgrave and the Archbishop remained unsettled. Notably, medieval writers recorded the event only in brief entries. The king, having nearly met a truly disgusting end, had little desire to memorialize such a fiasco, and the Erfurt tragedy remained a relatively obscure footnote in imperial history. Yet the Erfurt Latrine disaster's true significance lies in what didn't happen. Had Henry VI himself perished in that cesspit, the future of the empire, and indeed of European history, might have veered onto a very different path. Henry's survival ensured that he went on to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, and eventually one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. He led imperial armies on crusade, he captured and ransomed England's king Richard the Lionheart, and extended his dominion deep into southern Italy and Sicily. None of those momentous events would have come to pass if an overloaded floor in Erfurt had claimed the king's life that day. People have long questioned how such a bizarre catastrophe could have occurred in the first place. The simplest explanation is also the most plausible. An overcrowded hall and structural decay combined to cause a deadly failure. The wooden floor's supports were reportedly rotten, and the sheer weight of nearly 100 assembled men, many of them semi-armored nobles, was more than the old timbers could bear. The citadel's latrine below was especially large and had seldom been emptied, so it contained a vast quantity of sewage at the time. That said, there's a much more sinister theory about why this happened. The primary reason for the meeting in Erfurt was to mediate a bitter feud between two powerful men, Ludwig III, Landgrave of Thuringia, and Conrad of Wittelsbach, Archbishop of Mainz. Both were influential, ambitious, and had powerful rivals who might have found it advantageous if either or both were eliminated. Ludwig III, as Landgrave of Thuringia, was deeply involved in territorial disputes that had drawn hostility from various nobles in central Germany. His aggressive pursuit of power, coupled with his refusal to acknowledge the authority of Archbishop Conrad, placed him squarely at odds with powerful church authorities. Conrad of Mainz, for his part, wielded immense influence not only in religious matters, but in secular governance as well. It's conceivable that rival factions could have sought a permanent solution to the persistent instability caused by Ludwig and Conrad's feud. A tragedy that seemed like an accident would be a perfect cover. Plausible deniability, limited risk of exposure, and minimal direct reprisals. In essence, the Erfurt latrine disaster may have been the medieval equivalent of taking down a passenger plane just to eliminate one target. Another intriguing angle involves King Henry VI himself. It's important to remember that during the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire was an extremely powerful player in European politics, and not the decrepit entity it would develop into. At only 18, Henry was heir apparent to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and his future influence over European politics was already significant. His demise would have sent shockwaves throughout Europe, reshuffling political alliances and possibly setting off a struggle for succession that many ambitious nobles might find advantageous. Henry's father had no shortage of enemies within the empire. Many princes felt oppressed by imperial centralization efforts and would have welcomed a weakened monarchy. Removing Henry would destabilize Barbarossa's carefully planned succession, potentially freeing them from central control. If the collapse was indeed deliberate sabotage, the method, rotted or weakened floor beams, was subtle enough to appear natural, yet devastating enough to achieve maximum lethality. Whoever orchestrated this would have needed inside access to the building beforehand, a plausible scenario considering the numerous local servants and retainers employed by nobles. This method would require no elaborate weapons or obvious tampering, just deliberate weakening of the timbers, so a full haul would result in a disaster. For conspirators, the horrific randomness could be beneficial. The tragedy's broad carnage might obscure motives, eliminating suspicion on who was targeted. After all, the event had numerous high-profile attendees who had enemies who wanted them eliminated. Interestingly, many find it quite odd that Henry and the Archbishop were sitting in a stone alcove at the precise moment of the fall, while the Landgrave fell into the pit. It's been suggested that Henry and the Archbishop may have been plotting together to increase the power of the Church in the region. The thought is that this may have been in exchange for papal support of Emperor Barbarossa's attempt to turn the Holy Roman Empire into a hereditary monarchy. If this was the case, the plot failed, and Henry beat a hasty retreat, and chroniclers kept their discussions of this event to a bare minimum. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg saw one of history's strangest epidemics, a dancing plague in which dozens of people danced compulsively in the streets for weeks on end. Contemporary reports describe the sufferers flailing their arms and convulsing uncontrollably, faces dripping with sweat and feet bleeding through their shoes. These weren't joyous revelers, but ordinary citizens seized by a mysterious compulsion, and some danced themselves to exhaustion or even death as crowds watched in disbelief. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa suddenly stepped into a Strasbourg street and began dancing without rest, as if entranced. Within days, dozens of others had joined her, caught up in the same unexplainable urge to dance. The dancing epidemic spread to as many as 400 people, all swaying and twirling in a trance-like state. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some reportedly suffered fatal strokes or heart attacks as the marathon dancing went on and on. The strange episode persisted into September, shocking the city's authorities and baffling all who witnessed it. Strasbourg's city leaders were alarmed by this bizarre plague and struggled to find a remedy. At first, they consulted the town's physicians, who declared the dance to be a natural illness caused by overheated blood. Under the medieval humoral understanding of medicine, an excess of hot blood needed to be expelled from the body. Following this advice, the authorities encouraged the afflicted to continue dancing the sickness out. The idea was that if the sufferers danced continuously, the fever of the dance would burn itself out. This well-intentioned cure, however, backfired horribly. The sight of dozens of people dancing madly in public only fueled the town's superstition. Many onlookers believed the dancers were victims of St. Vitus's curse, a divine punishment forcing sinners to dance, and they feared that they could be next. In the fervor, even more people joined in the compulsive dance, swept up by what we might now call crowd psychology. One later chronicle claimed that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people a day were dying from strokes, heart failure, or exhaustion, and the city authorities realized their mistake. Instead of encouraging dancing, they now banned all forms of shimmying and shaking in Strasbourg. Finally, in late August, officials gathered the remaining afflicted dancers, loaded them into wagons, and sent them to a shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby mountains. According to reports, priests at the shrine performed a special ritual to cure the dancers. The exhausted men and women were given small crosses to hold and made to wear red shoes painted with holy crosses on the soles. They were led around a wooden effigy of St. Vitus, while priests chanted prayers and sprinkled holy water and consecrated oil. This act of devotion, combined with the distance from the public eye, seemed to break whatever spell had gripped them. Word soon spread that St. Vitus had forgiven the sufferers, and the dance mania gradually subsided. By early September 1518, the plague had finally run its course, and the city fell quiet, left to wonder what exactly had just happened. For all the relief at its end, one question remained. What caused this bizarre outbreak? Despite becoming the most well-known dancing mania, the 1518 incident was far from an isolated case. In fact, outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing had occurred in Europe before, especially in the Rhine River region. A particularly large eruption in 1374 saw people in dozens of towns convulsing in dance until they collapsed. However, there are documented cases going back to the 10th and 11th centuries in what is now Germany and Italy. Yet the Strasbourg episode of 1518 was the last and best documented of these strange events, and even in its own time people struggled to explain it. Contemporary observers offered both supernatural and natural theories. Many among the pious believed it was the work of divine wrath or demonic possession. The curse of Saint Vitus was a primary suspect, which is why so many victims and their families turned to prayer and saintly intercession. Meanwhile, doctors and city officials dismissed otherworldly causes and blamed physical or psychological ones, such as an excess of hot blood overwhelming the brain. The famed physician Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg a few years later, even put forward an eccentric theory that the plague began as a kind of ruse. He claimed Frau Trophea had feigned her affliction to embarrass her husband, and that other women began dancing to thumb their noses at their own husbands. While his explanation now seems absurd, and was likely even then a minority view, it at least shifted the blame from angry saints and demons toward human psychology. In truth, no consensus existed at the time. The people of 1518 were grasping for answers to an event that must have felt as inexplicable as it was terrifying. In modern times, historians and scientists have continued to puzzle over the dancing plague of 1518. Several hypotheses have been proposed, but only one has gained broad acceptance. One suggestion is food poisoning, the idea that villagers might have consumed bread made from rye tainted with ergot, a fungus that can produce hallucinations and convulsions. Notably, this theory was once widely accepted by academics as the likely cause of the event. However, this theory is now largely discounted since ergot poisoning renders individuals bedridden after an initial burst of energy. This, of course, doesn't fit with people dancing for months on end. Another theory claims that the dancers were members of a heretical religious sect or cult engaging in ecstatic ritual. However, there's no direct evidence for any secret cult involvement, and this idea remains speculative and not widely supported by historians. The most widely accepted explanation for the 1518 dancing plague is that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. Essentially, it was a mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress and pervasive fear. Strasbourg in 1518 was a community under enormous strain. The region had been struck by a series of bad harvests and famine, and was stalked by diseases like smallpox and the recently arrived syphilis. Facing hunger and illness, people also shared a deep-seated cultural superstition, a belief that Saint Vitus could punish sinners by making them dance uncontrollably. In a state of heightened anxiety, one person's spontaneous dancing could unconsciously set off a chain reaction. Modern psychologists now accept that in certain contexts, groups of people can exhibit physical symptoms with no obvious physical cause. In 1518, the citizens of Strasbourg arguably experienced just such a phenomenon. The first dancer, Frau Trophea, might have been the spark, and the city's collective stress and belief in the curse of Saint Vitus was the tinder. As the fear spread, dozens of others essentially tranced themselves into the same hysterical dance. The fact that the sufferers truly couldn't control their movements, yet later recovered, aligns with what we now understand about psychosomatic disorders fueled by stress and expectation. In other words, the dancing plague was likely a massive stress-induced psychosis that spread by example and suggestion through an anxious community. That said, while this hypothesis has gained widespread acceptance, it hasn't yet been definitively proven. In fact, over the centuries, a number of proposed causes have reached consensus-level understanding, only to go out of fashion. If you asked an educated person 500 years ago, they would have almost certainly talked about overheated blood. Fast forward to 50 years ago, and the modern-day equivalents were talking about rye bread and ergot. Now here we are in the present day, and mass psychogenic illness is the present consensus among scholars. Perhaps in another 50 years, it'll be something different entirely. On a cold November evening in 1643, with the thunder of cannon fire shaking the walls of Rottweil, hundreds of frightened townspeople gathered inside the Dominican church. Clutching their rosaries, they prayed desperately for deliverance from the siege outside. According to numerous accounts, their prayers were answered in a most startling way. The statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar seemed to come alive. Witnesses said Mary's face shifted in color, and her eyes moved, gazing upward and then back down toward the beleaguered city. Some believed they heard her voice in the hushed church. This 1643 incident, later known as Our Lady of the Turning Eyes, would become one of the most famous miracles of the 30 Years' War. In the autumn of 1643, the walled city of Rottweil, a Catholic stronghold in the Holy Roman Empire, was battered by a siege in the last decade of the 30 Years' War. The French had fully encircled the city, cutting off supplies while the walls of the city withstood bombardment. The situation grew desperate as bombardments breached sections of the aging medieval walls by mid-November. Inside Rottweil, fear and turmoil reigned, and the exhausted defenders argued over whether to hold out or surrender to the enemy, who promised to spare civilians if the city yielded. It was in this dire atmosphere that an extraordinary event was reported. The Dominican friars, together with hundreds of townspeople, held continuous rosary prayers inside Rottweil's Dominican church. According to eyewitnesses, on November 10th, 1643, the statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar suddenly changed. The Madonna's face appeared to turn pale, and her carved eyes came to life and moved, shifting upward toward heaven, then downward toward the congregation and the city. Some present even claimed they heard a soft sigh or word from the statue. Both Catholics and a few skeptical Protestants who had taken refuge in the church witnessed this uncanny occurrence. Stunned worshippers were reportedly moved to tears and awe at the sight. News of the miracle of the turning eyes spread through the city in the following days. Many believers interpreted Mary's movements as a direct response to their fervent prayers, as if the Virgin were acknowledging their pleas and interceding with her Son for Rottweil's safety. This helped the besieged Rottweilers' morale immensely, and all talks of giving up the city ceased. On November 25th, 1643, about 2 weeks after the first incident, a second phenomenon was reported. Witnesses saw the statue's face, formerly so pale, suddenly become flush with color, as if the statue had once again come to life. Once again her eyes seemed to shift their gaze, and a few tears were seen glistening on her cheeks. That same night, miles away at Tuttlingen, a relief army of Bavarian, Spanish, and Imperial forces launched a surprise attack on the French camp. The enemy was completely routed in the Battle of Tuttlingen, and the siege of Rottweil was abruptly lifted. To the faithful, the timing was no coincidence. Clearly, the intercession of the Virgin Mary had saved the city. The reported miracle at Rottweil reverberated throughout Catholic Europe. In 1643, the war's 25th year, Catholics saw this event as a powerful sign of divine favor amid chaos. The occurrence came during the Counter-Reformation's peak of Marian devotion, when Mary was often invoked as a heavenly protectress in battle. To the faithful, the Virgin's intervention at Rottweil seemed to confirm that heaven was on their side. Catholic preachers and writers pointed to the episode as proof of their true faith's power, encouraging the devout to persevere. According to contemporary accounts, some Protestants who witnessed the event were reported to have been so moved by the occurrence that they converted to Catholicism. Given the dozens of eyewitness accounts and the rapid spread of the story in print, church authorities took the claims of 1643 very seriously. A formal inquiry gathered the testimony of 42 eyewitnesses, and on March 14th, 1644, the church officially confirmed the miracle as worthy of belief. That same year, a printed report of the event circulated in Catholic regions, spreading Rottweil's fame. The church soon became a site of pilgrimage, with many visitors coming to venerate the miraculous image, with some even claiming cures or other favors in Mary's name. There are three common explanations for what happened at Rottweil. The traditional Catholic interpretation views this incident as a genuine miracle. According to this theory, the Virgin Mary, moved by the fervent prayers of the besieged residents, visibly turned her eyes as a sign of compassion, reassurance, and divine protection. Supporters point to the precise timing of the second event, which occurred just before Rottweil was miraculously relieved in the Battle of Tuttlingen. For centuries, this has remained the dominant explanation among believers, solidifying Rottweil's Marian devotion and confirming for many the legitimacy of their Catholic faith. A popular skeptical modern theory suggests that the incident resulted from a psychological phenomenon, specifically mass hysteria or collective delusion induced by extreme stress. In 1643, the residents of Rottweil were under intense psychological strain due to prolonged siege warfare, fear, hunger, and uncertainty. Under these conditions, suggestible individuals may have interpreted subtle visual cues, such as flickering candlelight, shadows, or reflections, as movements of the statue's eyes. According to this view, as news of the event spread, confirmation bias and peer pressure likely reinforced eyewitness accounts, solidifying the event's perceived miraculous nature. Another modern explanation proposes that the phenomenon was the result of a natural optical illusion. The apparent shifting eyes and changes in facial coloration could have been due to shifting light conditions from candles, torches, and reflective surfaces within the church. Wooden statues, painted and varnished, can appear to move subtly depending on the angle of illumination and viewer perspective, particularly under flickering candle light. Small environmental factors like humidity, temperature changes, or minor movements of the statue's supporting structure may also have contributed to the illusion. According to this explanation, this may have convinced observers that they had witnessed a miraculous event. Whatever the case, what's clear is that the first sighting calmed the nerves of the people of Rottweil. The second sighting, 2 weeks later, and coinciding with the break of the siege, appeared to confirm that this event had led to the deliverance of the town.